CEO hurt his pregnant wife for a mistress, but when she left, he broke down. I lost a queen, a great love story, with a powerful end and a surprise. In Chapter 6, Dear God, thank you for bringing us together again. Bless this beautiful family watching now, the old souls and the new. Give them peace in the chaos, strength in their weakness, and love that never fades. Let this story bring healing to whoever needs it most today. Amen. Hi, my beautiful family. To all our new members, welcome home. This is not just a channel, it's a family, and from today, you are part of it. Feel free to introduce yourself in the comments. We'd love to know you. And yes, today's story holds something powerful. There's a surprise waiting in Chapter 6, so please don't stop halfway. If this story touches your heart, please like, comment, and share. Your support keeps this family growing. Let's begin. Alana Michaela stood barefoot on the wraparound porch of her grandmother's Victorian house, watching dawn paint Magnolia Springs in shades of gold and possibility. 3 years had passed since she'd last breathed this honeysuckle-scented air. 3 years since she'd fled this sanctuary with a shattered heart and empty arms. Now, at 28, she had returned, not as the broken woman who'd left, but as someone who'd learned to build beauty from ashes. The house on Willow Lane waited for her like a patient lover. Painted the softest shade of lavender with white gingerbread trim, it stood among towering magnolia trees whose blooms released their intoxicating fragrance into the humid morning air. Her grandmother Cordelia had left her this haven, along with a note written in fading violet ink. Every woman needs a place where her soul can remember who she was before the world tried to change her. Alana pressed her hand to her still flat belly, where new life grew with quiet certainty. Theodore Ashworth's child. The thought should have filled her with pure joy, yet something indefinable whispered through her chest, not sadness, but a strange hollowness that made her wonder if happiness could be too gentle, too safe, to fully satisfy a heart that had once burned with wilder fire. Theodore was everything David Kane had never been. Where David had been passionate storms and unpredictable tides, Theodore was steady rainfall, nourishing carefully planted gardens. Where David had been midnight conversations and stolen kisses in empty art galleries, Theodore was afternoon tea and classical concerts attended with appropriate appreciation. Where David had been the kind of love that left scars, Theodore was the kind that promised to heal them. She should be grateful. She was grateful. After the devastation David had brought into her life, Theodore's predictable devotion felt like salvation itself. The town square came alive slowly, like a watercolor painting touched by morning light. Evangeline Blackwood emerged from her cottage, hanging laundry that danced in the breeze like prayer flags. Augustus Fairweather swept the steps of his antique shop, humming hymns that had comforted generations. Magnolia Sinclair tended flower boxes outside the post office, her silver hair catching sunlight like spun moonbeams. This was why she'd come home, not just to plan her wedding to Theodore, but to remember the woman she'd been before heartbreak had tried to convince her she was too much, too intense, too foolishly romantic for her own good. In Charleston, surrounded by Theodore's sophisticated friends and carefully curated life, she sometimes felt like a wildflower planted in formal gardens, beautiful enough, but somehow out of place among more cultivated blooms. Her phone buzzed against the porch railing, Theodore's name glowing on the screen like a gentle summons back to the life she'd chosen. "Good morning, my love." His cultured voice carried the warmth of someone who'd never had to raise it to be heard, the privilege of confidence born rather than earned. "Morning," she replied, settling into her grandmother's rocking chair. The wood was worn smooth by decades of women who'd sat here processing joy and sorrow in equal measure. "I was just watching the town wake up. It's so peaceful here." "I'm sure it is, darling. though I do worry about you in such an isolated place. I've arranged for Dr. Helena Ravenswood to see you this week. She trained at Johns Hopkins and comes highly recommended for high-risk pregnancies." Alana's grip tightened on the phone. "High risk? Theodore, I'm perfectly healthy. This pregnancy is completely normal." "Of course, sweetheart, but at your age, and given your history, we must take every precaution. I've also contacted a gardening service for your grandmother's property. They'll maintain everything perfectly while you focus on more important matters." Each arrangement felt like silk rope, beautiful and soft but binding nonetheless. Theodore loved her. She knew this with absolute certainty, but his love came wrapped in golden chains, protecting her from everything that might cause harm, including the very experiences that made life worth living. "Theodore, I want to tend the garden myself. Those roses, they're connected to my grandmother, to my history here. It's important to me." "Darling, manual labor in your condition is inadvisable. Let professionals handle such things. I'm having a security system installed as well. That old house is far too vulnerable, and I can't bear the thought of you alone and unprotected." The conversation continued, each of Theodore's protective measures feeling like feathers that would eventually smother if allowed to accumulate. When the call ended, Alana sat in the gentle morning silence, watching a cardinal build its nest in the ancient oak tree that had sheltered her grandmother's meditations for 60 years. She walked to the back garden where Cordelia's roses grew wild and magnificent. These weren't the precisely pruned specimens Theodore would prefer. These roses sprawled and climbed and burst with uncontrolled beauty. Crimson blooms tangled with soft pink ones, and creamy white blossoms released their perfume into air thick with memory and possibility. Kneeling in the rich, dark soil, Alana let her hands find the familiar rhythm of tending growing things. The earth was warm and forgiving, accepting her touch without question or condition. As she worked, memories drifted through her mind like fragments of half-remembered songs. "Alana, baby, come see what I planted for you." David's voice, young and full of dreams, echoed from chambers of her heart she'd thought sealed forever. He'd been 25 then, all ambition and tender promises, his dark hair falling across eyes that saw poetry in her every movement. "It's called eternal love," he'd whispered against her ear, arms circling her waist, as he showed her the single rosebush he'd planted on their tiny apartment balcony. "The man at the nursery said it blooms twice a year, spring and fall, like how I fall in love with you all over again every season." She'd laughed and turned in his arms, hands fisting in his shirt as she pulled him down for a kiss that tasted like forever. They'd been so young, so certain that love was enough to conquer any storm that might threaten their happiness. The memory shifted, darkened. 6 months pregnant, glowing with anticipation, she'd come home early to surprise David with dinner. The roses on their balcony were blooming, spring's second showing, just as he'd promised. But David wasn't alone. Serafina Beaumont had been draped across their couch like expensive silk, platinum hair catching afternoon light streaming through windows that suddenly felt too small to contain Alana's expanding world. David's shirt was unbuttoned, his hair mussed by hands that weren't hers. The woman's laugh was like crystal breaking against stone. "Oh," Serafina had said, not bothering to adjust her disheveled state, "you must be the wife." The words that followed blurred together, David's stammered explanations, Serafina's casual cruelty, the sound of her own heartbeat drowning out voices that no longer seemed to belong in her world. She'd stood there, one hand pressed to her rounded belly, feeling their baby kick as if sensing the earthquake about to destroy their foundation. 2 days later, she'd lost the baby. The doctors spoke of stress factors and medical complications, but Alana knew the truth that lived in her bones. Her heart had shattered so completely that even the new life growing inside her couldn't survive the devastation. A tear dropped onto the rich soil, and Alana realized she was crying. After 3 years, the memories still possessed the power to steal her breath and leave her gasping. She wiped her face with the back of her gardening glove, leaving a streak of earth across her cheek like war paint earned in battles fought in silence. That version of herself, the trusting young woman who'd believed in eternal love, had died in that apartment, along with her dreams of forever. What had risen from those ashes was someone more careful, someone who chose security over passion and gentle devotion over consuming fire. Theodore had found her at her lowest point, volunteering at the children's hospital to fill the emptiness where her baby should have been. He'd courted her like something precious and fragile, never asking more than she was ready to give. When he'd proposed 6 months ago, she'd said yes, not because her heart soared, but because her soul was tired of flying. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ophelia Sinclair, the town librarian. "Coffee at Lavinia's this afternoon? I have wedding cake samples that will make you weep with joy." Alana smiled, typing her acceptance. This was her life now. Gentle friendships, peaceful moments, love that didn't threaten to consume, but promised to sustain. She was done with the kind of passion that left scars. As she stood to go inside, brushing soil from her jeans, movement caught her eye. A figure stood at her property's edge, partially hidden by the ancient oak's sprawling branches. For one heart-stopping moment, her mind played its cruelest trick. She thought she saw David's familiar silhouette, the way he used to lean against doorframes when lost in thought. But when she looked again, only shadows remained, dancing with wind through leaves that whispered like secrets being born. Alana shook her head, laughing at her foolishness. David Kane was buried in her past, a chapter written in ash and regret. He had no claim on the woman she'd become, no place in the life she was building from carefully chosen pieces. She was finally free of his shadow, finally ready to step into sunlight that didn't remind her of dreams that had died before they could bloom. The roses nodded in the breeze as if blessing her resolution, their petals scattered like confetti celebrating the life she was choosing. Safe, sure, and utterly, completely hers. Chapter 2. The Return of Shadows. The past never announces itself with trumpets. It slips through cracks in your carefully built walls like smoke, filling every room you thought you'd locked forever. David Kane stepped off the Greyhound bus in Magnolia Springs, carrying nothing but a worn leather duffel bag and 3 years' worth of regret that had carved hollows beneath his eyes. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms and owned half the Charleston skyline now stood in a town square that could fit inside his former penthouse, wearing jeans faded from actual wear and a simple blue shirt that had seen better days. The transformation hadn't been voluntary. Serafina Beaumont had taken more than his heart when she'd finished with him. She'd systematically destroyed his company, his reputation, and every material possession he'd foolishly believed defined his worth. The predatory smile she'd worn while her lawyers explained how thoroughly she'd dismantled his life still haunted his sleep. But in the rubble of his former existence, David had discovered something unexpected. The man he'd been before success had transformed him into someone he barely recognized. The private investigator's report lay folded in his jacket pocket, clinical details about Alana's new life that read like poetry to his starving heart. Subject has established residence in Magnolia Springs, engaged to Theodore James Ashworth, architect, gallery owner, wedding planned for late summer. Subject appears content, well integrated into community. Content. The word had hit him like a physical blow. After everything he'd destroyed, everything he'd stolen from her, Alana had found contentment. The knowledge should have sent him straight back to Charleston, should have convinced him that his presence here could only disturb the peace she'd fought so hard to build. Instead, he'd bought a bus ticket, Evangeline Blackwood's cottage sat on Elderbury Lane like a grandmother's gentle reproof, small, weathered, but undeniably honest. When he'd called about renting it, her voice had carried the sort of maternal authority that made grown men confess their sins without being asked. "You hurt that girl something fierce," she'd said without preamble. "But my grandmother always said every soul deserves a chance to tend their own garden, whether they're planting seeds or pulling weeds. Cottage is yours if you need it. But you mind your manners in my town, David Kane. We protect our own here." He'd been in Magnolia Springs exactly 4 hours when he saw her. The Saturday farmers' market bloomed in the town square like an impressionist painting, vendors spreading their wares beneath ancient oaks, while families wandered between stalls, selling everything from honey to hand-stitched quilts. David had come seeking the anonymous comfort of crowds, never imagining his carefully reconstructed world would shatter the moment Alana Michaela laughed. The sound struck him like lightning, stopping his feet so abruptly that Augustus Fairweather nearly collided with him. But David barely registered the elderly man's irritated grunt, because there she was, Alana, more radiant than memory had dared preserve, standing beside Cordelia Whitmore's flower stall, with her head thrown back in genuine delight. She wore a sundress the color of summer sky, her dark skin luminous with health and happiness. Her hair was longer now, twisted up to reveal the graceful line of her neck, and when she moved, it was with the fluid confidence of a woman who'd made peace with herself. She looked settled, whole, completely at home in her own skin, in a way she'd never quite managed when they were together. David's chest constricted with pain that had nothing to do with his own loss and everything to do with the breathtaking beauty of seeing her healed. Cordelia Whitmore, whose silver hair was pinned with gardening clips and whose eyes held 8 decades of accumulated wisdom, was showing Alana something in a small wooden box. When Alana opened it, her face lit up with such pure joy that David found himself stepping closer, despite every rational thought screaming at him to leave. "Oh, Miss Cordelia, these are perfect." Alana's voice carried easily through the morning air, warm and musical and exactly as he remembered. "Theodore will adore them for the wedding arrangements. Theodore." The name hit David like ice water, though he'd known, of course. The investigator had been thorough. Theodore Ashworth, successful architect, gallery owner, collector of rare books and apparently rare women. A man who could offer Alana the stable, gentle life David had destroyed with his selfish weakness. The name should have sent him retreating to his rented cottage, should have convinced him to catch the next bus to anywhere else. Instead, he found himself walking closer, drawn by a force he couldn't name and lacked the strength to resist. He was near enough now to see the way Alana's engagement ring caught morning sunlight, a tasteful solitaire that spoke of thoughtful selection rather than passionate impulse. Close enough to notice the subtle changes 3 years had brought, laugh lines around her eyes, the way she carried herself with new certainty, the gentle glow that meant. His blood turned to Arctic water. She was pregnant. The realization staggered him. Alana was going to have the family they'd dreamed of, the baby they'd lost, the life he'd thrown away for a woman who'd never loved anything but the power she could gain from destroying it. She was going to be a mother, just as she'd always wanted, just as she should have been 3 years ago if he hadn't been too weak to resist temptation. The wooden box nearly slipped from Alana's hands as her gaze drifted across the square. Their eyes met across 20 feet of cobblestones and 3 years of silence, and David watched every trace of joy drain from her face like color bleeding from watercolors. Her lips parted in a soft gasp, one hand instinctively moving to press against her stomach in a protective gesture that shattered something fundamental in David's chest. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply stared. 2 people who'd loved with the kind of intensity that left permanent marks. 2 people who'd wounded each other in ways that time couldn't fully heal. Cordelia glanced between them with eyes that missed nothing, her weathered hands gently taking the box from Alana's nerveless fingers. "Child, you've gone pale as cotton. You know this man." But Alana didn't answer. Without a word, without acknowledgement, without even the courtesy of recognition, she turned and walked away. Her steps were measured, dignified, betraying nothing of whatever storm might be raging behind her careful composure. She moved through the market like royalty, nodding to friends and neighbors with perfect grace, while David stood frozen among scattered rose petals that had fallen from a vendor's display. He watched her disappear around the corner onto Willow Lane, watched until even the flutter of her blue dress was lost to sight, and only then realized he was breathing like a drowning man. "Lord, have mercy," Cordelia muttered, and David turned to find the elderly woman studying him with the sort of penetrating stare that could strip a soul bare. "You're him, aren't you? The one who broke our girl's heart into pieces so small she's still finding some of them." David opened his mouth to speak, but found he had no words. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he'd spent 3 years learning what he'd destroyed? That he'd come not to win her back, but simply to witness her happiness, to know she'd found the peace his betrayal had stolen? Cordelia's expression softened fractionally, though her tone remained stern as winter wind. "Whatever you're thinking, boy, you'd better think harder. That girl has been through fire and came out gold. She's building something beautiful now, something that won't break her into pieces she might not survive putting back together again." "I know," David finally managed, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't categorize. I needed to see that she was okay, that she was happy. I lost a queen for fool's gold, and I had to know she'd found the kingdom she deserved. And now you've seen it. Question is, what are you planning to do with that knowledge?" The question hung between them like incense, heavy and inescapable. What was he planning to do? He'd convinced himself he'd come for closure, to make amends if possible, to see with his own eyes that Alana had found the love she deserved. But standing here now, having witnessed her contentment and the life she'd built from the ashes of their marriage, David realized he hadn't thought beyond this moment. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty feeling like a small absolution. Cordelia studied him for a long moment, taking in his worn clothes, his empty hands, the way he stood like a man who'd learned to carry his mistakes like stones in his pockets. "You look different than I expected. Smaller somehow. More human." "Success has a way of making a man forget who he really is," David replied. "Losing everything has a way of helping him remember." "And who are you, David Kane? Without the money and power and all the things that made you think you could have everything you wanted without consequences." For 3 years, David had been wrestling with that exact question, peeling away layers of ambition and entitlement until he found the man beneath. Flawed, foolish, but capable of genuine love if he could learn to offer it without conditions. "I'm someone who destroyed the best thing in his life for something that was never real," he said quietly. "Someone who spent every day since learning what love actually means and knowing he learned it too late to matter." Cordelia nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she'd suspected. "That cottage you're renting belongs to me. Evangeline handles the business, but I own the property. She thought you might be different than the man who left here 3 years ago, and I told her she was a fool for taking such a risk." She paused, studying him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "But looking at you now, maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. You're still a fool for coming here, mind you. That girl doesn't need reminders of her worst nightmare walking around town, but maybe she needs to see that the monster who broke her wasn't actually a monster, just a man who made terrible choices because he was too broken to recognize what he had. How do I show her that without causing more pain?" "Carefully," Cordelia replied. "From a distance, and maybe not at all, if you're truly as changed as you claim. Love isn't about what you need, boy. It's about what she needs. You remember that, and maybe you'll find a way to give her something worth having, even if it's just the knowledge that she deserved better than what you gave her before. As Cordelia walked away, David stood alone among the market stalls, surrounded by the gentle bustle of a town that had no place for who he'd been, but might, possibly, have room for who he was trying to become. Her silence had been exactly what he deserved, and somehow more devastating than any words could have been. Chapter 3. The Weight of Words Unspoken. There are wounds that time cannot heal, and words that arrive 3 years too late, carrying the weight of all the silence that came before. The cottage on Elderbury Lane had become David's purgatory, 4 walls that witnessed his sleepless nights, and the careful choreography of avoiding the woman whose life he'd once shared. 5 days had passed since their silent encounter at the farmer's market. 5 days of dawn walks through empty fields and afternoons spent chopping wood for Augustus Fairweather, anything to keep his hands busy and his heart from contemplating the impossible distance between regret and redemption. He'd mapped Alana's routines from fragments overheard in town: grocery shopping on Tuesday mornings, library visits on Wednesday afternoons, flower arranging at Lavinia's tea garden on Fridays. He structured his life around her schedule like a penitent organizing his days around prayer, ensuring their paths would never cross again. But Magnolia Springs was a small town with gentle rhythms that eventually pulled even the most reluctant souls into their current. Lavinia's tea garden occupied the ground floor of a Victorian house that had been converted into the sort of place where secrets were shared over Earl Grey and sorrows were sweetened with fresh-baked scones. David hadn't intended to go there. He'd been walking aimlessly after another sleepless night, his feet carrying him toward town before his mind could object. The brass bell above the door announced his entry with a delicate chime, and the gentle murmur of morning conversation paused just long enough for curious glances to catalogue his presence. Magnolia Sinclair looked up from her newspaper with sharp eyes, while Ophelia Sterling paused in her animated discussion of library book drives to assess him with the sort of penetrating gaze librarians had perfected over centuries of managing troublemakers. But it was the sight of Alana, sitting alone at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, that stopped time entirely. She wore a cream-colored sweater that made her skin glow like honey touched by morning light, her hair falling in soft waves that caught the golden illumination filtering through lace curtains. There was a serenity about her that hadn't existed during their marriage, as if she'd found some internal compass that no external storm could disturb. She was arranging flowers from a wicker basket, her movements graceful and sure as she created small bouquets with unconscious artistry. Their eyes met across the tea room's genteel chaos, and this time she didn't look away. The moment stretched between them like a bridge neither was certain they should cross. Around them, the careful dance of small-town politeness continued, but David felt as if he and Alana existed in a bubble where only truth could survive the pressure. She gestured to the empty chair across from her, with a movement so slight it might have been imagination, but David's heart recognized it as invitation. He crossed the room carefully, moving like someone approaching a wild creature who might bolt at sudden motion. "Alana," he said as he settled into the chair, her name feeling rusty on his tongue after 3 years of not saying it aloud. "David." Her voice was steady, measured, revealing nothing. "Cordelia mentioned you were staying in town." The conversation around them had resumed, but David remained aware of the attention still directed their way, protective, watchful, ready to intervene if necessary. These people loved her, he realized. They'd probably held her when she cried, brought casseroles when eating felt impossible, celebrated with her when she'd found happiness again. They were her chosen family, and he was the stranger who'd once stolen her away from everything safe and sure. "I didn't come to cause trouble," he said quietly, watching her hands as they worked. Those hands had once touched him with such tenderness, traced patterns on his chest while he slept, worn his ring like a promise they'd both believed would last forever. "Then why did you come?" She selected a white rose from her basket, its petals perfect and pristine. "And please don't tell me it was coincidence. We both know Magnolia Springs isn't exactly a tourist destination." The question he'd been dreading since buying his bus ticket. How could he explain that guilt had devoured him alive, that every sunset reminded him of evenings they'd shared on their tiny balcony, that he'd needed to see with his own eyes that she'd survived the wreckage he'd made of their life together? "I came because I owed you an explanation," he said finally, "and an apology that should have been given 3 years ago." Alana's hands stilled on the flowers. When she looked up, her eyes held depths he'd never seen before. Not the bright, trusting gaze of the woman he'd married, but something more complex, more carefully guarded. "I don't need your explanations, David. I learned to live without them a long time ago. But I need to give them." The words emerged rougher than he'd intended, weighted with desperation he'd hoped to keep hidden. "I need you to know that what happened, it wasn't about you. It was never about you not being enough." She set down the rose and leaned back in her chair, studying him with the sort of clinical attention she might give a particularly challenging piece of art she was trying to understand. "Serafina Beaumont was beautiful," Alana said, and David flinched at hearing that name spoken in her voice. "Sophisticated, confident, everything I wasn't. I've had 3 years to analyze why you chose her over me, over our baby, over the life we were building together." "Alana, no, let me finish." Her voice cut through his protest with quiet authority. "I spent months wondering what I could have done differently. Should I have dressed better, been more exciting, less needy, less ordinary?" Each word felt like a blade between his ribs. The thought that she'd spent even a moment blaming herself for his failures made him feel sicker than his worst hangover, more ashamed than the day he'd lost everything to Serafina's calculated destruction. "You were never ordinary," he said, his voice hoarse with conviction. "You were extraordinary. You still are. What I did—" "God, Alana, what I did had nothing to do with you and everything to do with the fact that I was so terrified of deserving you that I sabotaged everything good in my life before it could be taken away." She picked up another flower, a pink rose this time, its edges touched with cream. "That sounds like something you learned in therapy." 3 years of it, he admitted. "After I lost the company, after Serafina took everything I thought mattered. After I realized that the only thing that had ever actually mattered was sitting in a hospital room, losing our baby because I was too selfish and scared to fight for what we had." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, impossible to take back, too heavy to ignore. Alana's hands trembled slightly as she added the pink rose to her arrangement, but her voice remained steady. "The baby wasn't your fault, David. The doctors said stress could be a contributing factor, but—" She paused, gathering herself. "Things like that happen. I understand that now. But it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't brought that stress into our lives. If I hadn't been too weak to resist temptation, too proud to admit I was struggling, too afraid to tell you that I felt like I was drowning in the pressure of trying to be the man you deserved." Alana looked up then, and for just a moment he glimpsed the woman who'd loved him unconditionally, who'd believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. "You never told me you were struggling. You just pulled away, started working later, talking less, touching me like I was made of glass instead of flesh and blood. I thought I was losing you, but I didn't know how to fight for something you seemed determined to destroy." The admission hung between them, raw and honest and painful in its accuracy. David remembered those months before everything collapsed, how success had felt like a trap, how every achievement had only raised expectations higher, how he'd felt like an imposter wearing a life that belonged to someone worthier. I should have talked to you, should have trusted you with my fears instead of trying to carry them alone. But I was so afraid you'd realize you'd married the wrong man, that you deserved someone who had his life together, who could give you the world instead of just promises and potential. So you decided to prove me right by throwing away everything we'd built. There was no anger in her voice, just weary sadness that cut deeper than fury ever could. You were so afraid I'd leave that you made sure I had to? The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. Yes, and I've regretted it every day since. Alana was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working steadily through the flowers. Around them, the tea room continued its gentle hum of conversation, but David felt as if they existed in a pocket of time where only honesty could survive. "Serafina came to see me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "After I left the hospital, she wanted to make sure I knew exactly how little our marriage had meant to you. How easily you'd been seduced away from your pregnant wife by a woman who understood what powerful men really needed." David's vision went red around the edges. "She did what?" "She told me about the other times, the business trips where you weren't alone, the conferences where she was your companion. She wanted me to know that what I'd walked in on wasn't a moment of weakness, but the culmination of something that had been going on for months." "That's not... Alana, that wasn't true. What you saw that day, it was the first time, the only time. I swear to you, it doesn't matter now." Alana's voice carried finality that stopped his desperate explanations cold. "True or not, the damage was done. Our marriage was over the moment you let her into our home, into our bed, into the life we'd built together." She was right, and they both knew it. The specifics of his betrayal mattered less than the fact that he'd betrayed her at all, that he'd broken the trust that held their world together. "I know," he said quietly. "I know I can't undo what I did, can't take back the pain I caused you. But I needed you to know that losing you, losing our baby, losing the life we'd planned together, it destroyed me. Not dramatically, but in the real, grinding way that strips everything away until you're forced to see who you really are underneath all the pretense." "And who are you, David? Underneath all the pretense?" The question he'd been wrestling with for 3 years, through therapy sessions and sleepless nights, through the humiliation of losing everything he'd thought defined him. "I'm a man who had everything he ever wanted, and threw it away because he was too afraid to believe he deserved it. I'm someone who learned what love actually meant only after he'd destroyed it." He paused, struggling for words that could carry the weight of his transformation. "I'm someone who spent 3 years learning how to be worthy of what I lost, even though I know it's too late to matter." Alana finished her arrangement in silence, the small bouquet a perfect balance of white and pink roses, baby's breath, and trailing ivy. It was beautiful in its simplicity, elegant without being showy, exactly like the woman who'd created it. "I'm glad you got help," she said finally, not looking at him. "I'm glad you learned to be better than you were. But David..." She raised her eyes to his, and in them he saw compassion mixed with unshakable resolution. "I forgave you a long time ago, not for your sake, but for mine. I had to, or the anger and hurt would have consumed me. But forgiveness doesn't mean I can trust you with my heart again. It doesn't mean I can risk the peace I've found by letting you back into my life." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box, setting it gently on the table between them. David's breath caught as he recognized it, the jewelry box that had held her grandmother's wedding ring, the one he'd given her on their wedding day with promises of forever. "I've carried this with me for 3 years," she said, opening the box to reveal the delicate gold band set with a small diamond. "Not because I couldn't let go, but because I wasn't ready to let go. But I'm ready now." She lifted the ring from its velvet nest and placed it on the table between them, where it caught morning light streaming through lace curtains. "Please don't take this as cruelty, because it's not meant that way. But David, I'm building a new life now. A good life, with a man who loves me completely, who sees me as his equal, who would never make me question my worth. I'm going to have the family I always dreamed of, surrounded by people who care about my happiness more than their own needs." She stood, gathering her purse and the remaining flowers, leaving the small bouquet beside the ring like an offering. "I hope you find peace, David. I truly do. I hope you find someone who can love the man you've become, because that man deserves happiness. But it can't be me. I can't be the one to validate your transformation or help you forgive yourself. I've worked too hard to build something beautiful from what was broken to risk shattering it again. Alana, please." But she was already walking away, moving through the tea room with quiet dignity. She paused at the door, not turning back but speaking just loudly enough for him to hear. "Please, let me have my peace, David. I've earned it." And then she was gone, leaving him alone with a ring that had once symbolized forever and flowers that smelled like goodbye. Chapter 4. The Garden of Second Chances. Sometimes redemption grows in the most unlikely soil, in the space between what was lost and what might yet be found, tended by hands that have learned the difference between taking and giving. The Magnolia Springs Community Garden existed in the gentle shadow of the old Methodist church, where rows of vegetables grew alongside healing herbs and flowers that bloomed for no purpose other than beauty. David discovered it on his 7th day in town, when sleepless guilt drove him from his cottage before dawn, and his aimless wandering led him to a place where broken things came to grow again. Augustus Fairweather was already there, his weathered hands coaxing life from reluctant soil, with the patience of someone who understood that growth couldn't be rushed. At 78, Augustus moved like a man half his age when he was among his plants, his arthritis forgotten in the presence of green things that responded to love with abundance. "You're Evangeline's tenant," Augustus said, without looking up from the tomato plants he was staking. It wasn't a question. In a town the size of Magnolia Springs, strangers were noted, discussed, and categorized within hours of arrival. David Kane. He offered his name like a man confessing a sin, expecting judgment or dismissal. "I know who you are, son." Augustus straightened, studying David with eyes that held no condemnation, only the calm assessment of someone who'd witnessed enough seasons to know that storms always passed eventually. "Question is, what are you planning to do with yourself while you're here?" David had no answer. He'd come to Magnolia Springs with nothing but regret and desperate hope, carrying no plans beyond the fantasy that seeing Alana might somehow ease the crushing weight of his mistakes. Now, after their devastating conversation at Lavinia's tea garden, he understood that his presence here served no purpose, except to remind her of pain she'd worked tirelessly to heal. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty feeling like relief. "I thought I did, but you didn't think past the wanting to the what comes after." Augustus nodded knowingly. "I've seen that particular folly before. Usually in young men who think love is about what they need instead of what they can give." The old man gestured toward a patch of earth that looked abandoned, choked with weeds and scattered with the debris of seasons past. "That there used to be Marianne Ashford's pride and joy, roses that would make angels weep," she used to say. "But Marianne passed last winter, and her family lives up in Charlotte now. Don't have time for the old woman's flowers." David stared at the neglected plot, seeing in it a reflection of everything he'd let wither through his own carelessness. "Garden needs tending," Augustus continued. "Not the dramatic kind, not grand gestures or expensive fixes, just the quiet, daily work of pulling weeds and watering what's left worth saving. You interested in that kind of labor?" Something in the old man's tone suggested he wasn't only talking about roses. "I don't know anything about gardening," David said. "Neither did I, 40 years ago, when my Lucinda dragged me out here after our boy died in Vietnam. Thought I could outrun grief by staying busy, but she was wiser than me. Knew that some kinds of healing require you to get your hands dirty, to tend to life even when your own feels finished." Augustus handed David a pair of worn gardening gloves and a small spade. "Start with the obvious weeds. We'll worry about what's worth saving once we can see what we're working with." The work was harder than David had expected, the Georgia sun unforgiving even in the early morning hours, his soft hands accustomed to keyboards and contracts blistered within the first hour. But there was something meditative about the rhythm of digging and pulling, something honest about the way soil clung to his clothes and sweat beaded on his forehead. By the third day, other volunteers had begun to acknowledge his presence with nods and cautious greetings. Magnolia Sinclair brought him sweet tea in a mason jar and advice about which weeds to pull first. Imogen Sterling, despite being nearly blind, could identify plants by touch and smell, guiding his inexperienced hands toward the struggling rose canes that might yet bloom again. On the fourth day, Alana came. David saw her before she saw him, walking through the garden gate with her own basket of tools and the sort of purposeful stride that suggested this was routine, not coincidence. She wore faded jeans and a simple white t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that made her look younger, more like the woman he'd fallen in love with 8 years ago. She was heading toward a section devoted to herbs and medicinal plants when she noticed him kneeling among Marianne's roses, his shirt soaked with sweat and his hands dark with rich earth. Their eyes met across 20 feet of carefully tended rows, and David watched her step falter as she recognized him. For a moment, he thought she might leave. Her gaze moved from his face to the garden plot he was working, taking in the cleared weeds and the struggling rose canes he'd carefully uncovered and staked. Something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, but a recognition of effort that hadn't been there before. She didn't approach him, but she didn't leave either. Instead, she settled into her own work, tending to a patch of lavender and chamomile with the same careful attention he was giving to Marianne's forgotten roses. They worked in silence for 2 hours, never speaking but aware of each other's presence, like dancers moving to music only they could hear. David found himself stealing glances at her, memorizing the way morning light caught in her hair, the gentle concentration on her face as she dead-headed spent blooms and whispered encouragement to struggling plants. When Imogen Sterling arrived with fresh lemonade and the sort of gentle authority that made resistance impossible, she settled on a wooden bench between their plots like a diplomat negotiating a delicate truce. "Beautiful morning for garden work," she said to no one in particular, her clouded eyes fixed on something beyond what ordinary sight could reveal. "Nothing like getting your hands in the earth to remind you what's real and what's just worry wearing fancy clothes." "Mrs. Sterling?" Alana's voice carried the careful politeness of someone navigating uncertain territory. "How long have you been working in this garden?" "Oh, 50 years or more, dear one. Started coming when my Harold was overseas in Korea, needed something to do with my hands besides wring them with worry. Garden taught me that some things grow in their own time, and others need a firm hand to guide them toward the light." She turned her face toward David, though he knew she couldn't see him clearly. "You're doing good work on Marianne's plot, young man. She would have liked knowing someone was caring for her roses again." "Did you know her well?" David asked, grateful for the neutral ground of a stranger's memory. Oh my, yes. Marianne was one of those souls who understood that gardens are about more than growing things. They're about hope. She used to say that planting a rose was an act of faith, betting on a future you might not live to see, but trusting someone else would appreciate the beauty you left behind. Imogen's words settled over them like morning mist, carrying weight that had nothing to do with gardening and everything to do with the space between regret and possibility. "She sounds wise," Alana said quietly. "Wise enough to know that some things are worth tending even when they look too far gone to save. And practical enough to know that not every plant that struggles is meant to survive." Imogen stood, brushing soil from her hands. "I'll leave you young people to your work. Remember, roses need patience, but they also need someone willing to prune away what's dead so new growth can flourish." After she left, the silence between David and Alana felt different, still careful, but no longer hostile. They continued working, the space between them measured not just in feet, but in the careful distance of two people who'd once shared everything and now shared only the memory of what that had cost them. It was nearly noon when Theodore's car pulled up to the garden gate. David heard it before he saw it, the low purr of an expensive engine that spoke of success and careful maintenance. Theodore Ashworth emerged from a silver BMW wearing khakis that had never seen honest work and a polo shirt that probably cost more than David's weekly grocery budget. He was exactly what David had expected, and somehow worse for being so perfectly predictable, tall, distinguished, with the sort of effortless confidence that came from never having to question whether you belonged in any room you entered. When he smiled at Alana, it was with the possessive warmth of a man secure in his ownership of something precious. "There you are, darling. I was worried when you didn't answer your phone." Alana looked up from her herbs, and David watched her carefully arrange her expression into something that resembled contentment. "I'm sorry, Theodore. I must have left it in the car. The morning got away from me." Theodore's gaze swept the garden until it found David, and his smile never wavered, though something cold flickered behind his eyes. "And you are?" "David Kane." He stood, acutely aware of his sweat-stained shirt and dirt-stained hands, feeling like exactly what he was, a man who'd lost everything and was trying to find meaning in manual labor. "Ah." Theodore's voice carried the polite dismissal of someone who'd heard all he needed to know. "I see you've found a way to occupy your time." The condescension was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in the sort of cultured politeness that made direct confrontation impossible. David felt his jaw clench, but managed to keep his voice level. "The garden needed attention. I had time to give." "How charitable of you." Theodore's arm settled around Alana's waist with casual ownership. "Darling, we should go. Dr. Ravenswood moved your appointment up an hour, and we mustn't keep her waiting." Alana nodded, gathering her tools with quick efficiency. As they prepared to leave, she looked back at David's work plot, taking in the cleared earth and carefully tended rose canes. "The roses are looking better," she said quietly. Marianne would have been pleased. It wasn't forgiveness or invitation, but it wasn't dismissal either. It was acknowledgement of his effort, of his care, of the possibility that even broken things might grow again if tended with patience and humility. After they left, David continued working until the afternoon heat made labor impossible. As he packed his tools, Augustus appeared beside him, surveying the day's progress with the critical eye of someone who knew the difference between work and mere activity. "You're learning," the old man said finally, "not just about roses, but about the kind of love that tends without expectation of reward." "She's happy with him," David said, the words tasting like ash. "Safe, protected, everything I never gave her. Maybe so, But happiness built on safety alone has shallow roots. Question is whether you're doing this for her peace of mind or your own. David looked at the roses he'd uncovered, their thorny canes reaching toward sunlight with the desperate hope of things that had survived winter and were determined to bloom again. Both, I think. But if I had to choose, her peace is more important than my redemption. Augustus nodded slowly, as if David had passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. Then maybe there's hope for you yet, son. Maybe there's hope for all of us. Chapter 5. The Letter from the Past. Memory is a faithless curator, preserving what we wish to forget while letting precious moments crumble to dust, until something resurfaces to remind us that love, once real, leaves marks that time cannot completely erase. Alana had avoided her grandmother's attic for 3 years, knowing that Cordelia Whitmore had been a keeper of memories, someone who preserved letters and photographs and baby clothes in cedar chests like a museum of might-have-beens. But Theodore's gentle insistence that they sort through everything before the wedding had finally driven her up the narrow stairs into the dusty sanctuary where the past waited with infinite patience. Sunlight filtered through a small round window, illuminating motes of dust that danced like spirits, reluctant to be disturbed. The attic smelled of lavender sachets and old wood, of secrets kept and stories half forgotten. Boxes lined the walls like monuments to lives fully lived, each one labeled in her grandmother's careful script. Christmas decorations, 1985 to 2010. Grandfather's books, Alana's school years. It was the smallest box that stopped her heart. Tucked behind a trunk of vintage quilts, almost hidden in the shadows, sat a white box tied with faded pink ribbon. The label, written in different handwriting, her own from years ago, read simply, "For our baby." Alana's knees buckled, and she sank onto an old rocking chair that creaked under her weight. She'd forgotten about this box. Forgotten that in those blissful early months of pregnancy, she'd started collecting things for the nursery she and David had planned. Tiny clothes in soft yellows and greens, a stuffed rabbit with velvet ears, a music box that played Brahms's lullaby. Her hands shook as she untied the ribbon, onesie no bigger than her palm, printed with the words, "Daddy's Little Angel," in silver script. David had bought it the day they'd confirmed the pregnancy, his eyes bright with wonder as he'd held it up and said, "Can you believe something this small is going to change our entire world?" Beneath the clothes, she found the journal she'd kept during those hopeful months, recording every milestone, every flutter of movement, every dream they'd shared for their child's future. Her own handwriting, younger and more optimistic, chronicled doctor visits and name discussions, and David's tender moments of talking to her growing belly. But it was the envelope at the very bottom that made her breath catch. Her name was written across the front in David's bold handwriting, but the paper was yellowed with age, the edges soft from handling. She recognized it immediately. The expensive stationery he'd used for important letters, the kind he'd chosen for their wedding invitations and business correspondence. Inside, 3 pages of his familiar script waited like a message from another lifetime. "My darling Alana, I'm writing this at 3 a.m., unable to sleep because I'm too excited about tomorrow. In 6 hours we have our ultrasound appointment, and we might finally learn whether we're having a son or daughter. Though honestly, I don't care which. I just want to see our baby again, to watch you light up the way you do whenever we talk about becoming parents. I've been thinking a lot lately about what kind of father I want to be. My own dad was so consumed with building his empire that he forgot to build relationships with his children. I swore I'd never be like that. But sometimes I catch myself working late or bringing stress home, and I remember how easily good intentions can be derailed by ambition. But then, I watch you humming to your belly while making dinner, or catch you researching baby books with the same intensity you once applied to art history, and I remember what really matters. You're going to be an incredible mother, Alana. Patient, nurturing, fierce in your love. Our child is so lucky to have you. I want to be worthy of that same trust. I want to be the kind of father who shows up, who remembers that success means nothing if you're too busy to read bedtime stories or bandage scraped knees. I want to love our child the way you've taught me to love, completely, without reservation, without keeping part of myself locked away. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in expectations, from the business, from clients who think I should be available 24 hours a day, from the part of myself that still fears I'm not good enough for the life we're building. But then you put my hand on your belly and our baby kicks, and suddenly everything else seems small and unimportant. I promise you, Alana, I promise our child that I will fight to be present. I will choose family over profit, connection over achievement, love over everything else that tries to pull me away from what matters most. By the time you read this, we might know if we're having David Jr. or little Cordelia, after your grandmother, of course. Either way, they'll be lucky to have you as their mother. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the family you've given me. All my love, David. I planted new roses on the balcony this morning, the climbing variety you love. By the time our baby is old enough to walk, they'll create a garden sanctuary where we can read stories and watch sunsets together. I can't wait to see you teach our child about beauty, about art, about finding magic in everyday moments. The letter slipped from Alana's nerveless fingers, floating to the attic floor like a feather released from a bird that had learned to fly without it. She stared at the pages, at handwriting that belonged to a man she'd barely recognized by the end of their marriage. This David, the one who'd written about choosing family over ambition, who'd planned rose gardens and worried about being present, was a stranger to the man who'd betrayed her 6 months later. What had happened between the writing of this letter and the moment she'd found him with Serafina? How had promises made in moonlight been so easily broken by daylight's temptations? She read the letter again, then a third time, searching for clues to the transformation she'd witnessed, but never understood. The man who'd written these words had loved her, had loved their baby, had dreamed of a future that looked nothing like the nightmare their marriage had become. Had Serafina's seduction been so complete that it had erased everything he'd felt for his own family? Or had the pressure he'd mentioned, the drowning feeling, the fear of not being good enough, finally consumed the love he'd tried so hard to protect? Her phone buzzed, Theodore's name appearing like a gentle summons back to the present. "How's the attic expedition going, darling?" Not too overwhelming, I hope. Alana looked around at the boxes of memories, at the letter that had rewritten everything she thought she knew about David's betrayal. It's revealing. I'm finding things I'd forgotten I'd lost. Nothing too upsetting, I hope. Remember, the past is meant to be left behind. We're building something new together, something better. His words were meant to comfort, but they sat uneasily in her chest. Was the past truly meant to be abandoned, or did understanding it help make sense of the present? "Theodore, can I ask you something? Do you think people can really change? Fundamentally, I mean." There was a pause, the kind that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "I believe people can modify their behavior, certainly. But core character, essential nature, that's usually fixed by adulthood. Why do you ask?" "Just, processing some old memories. I'll be down soon." After hanging up, Alana sat in the dusty silence, holding a letter that had been written by a man who seemed to understand what he was about to lose, and had lost it anyway. The David, who'd written about choosing love over ambition, had been real, but so had the David, who'd brought another woman into their bed. Could both versions exist in the same person? Could someone be capable of such tender love and such devastating betrayal? A sound from downstairs interrupted her thoughts. Theodore calling her name, probably wondering why she was taking so long. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box with the baby clothes and broken dreams, but she didn't retie the ribbon. Some secrets, once unearthed, refused to be buried again. As she descended the attic stairs, Alana carried with her the weight of new questions and the dangerous recognition that the story she'd told herself about David's betrayal might be missing crucial chapters. The man who'd written that letter had loved her. She could feel the truth of it in every word. But love, she'd learned, wasn't always enough to save people from their own worst impulses. The question that haunted her as she rejoined Theodore in the living room wasn't whether David had loved her, but whether the man who'd written that letter still existed somewhere beneath the ashes of what he'd destroyed, and whether it mattered if he did. Later that evening, while Theodore reviewed wedding vendor contracts in his methodical way, Alana found herself walking to her bedroom window, looking out toward the road that led to Elderbury Lane. Somewhere in the darkness, David was probably lying awake in his rented cottage, carrying his own collection of memories and regrets. Did he remember writing that letter? Did he remember the promises he'd made to a baby who would never be born, to a love he'd thrown away for something that had never been real? The questions followed her into sleep, where dreams mixed past and present into a confusion of what was, what might have been, and what could never be again. In those dreams, she was young and pregnant and full of hope, reading a letter from a man who promised to choose love over everything else. In those dreams, he'd kept his promise. But morning always came, bringing with it the reality of choices made and chances lost, of letters written by men who'd existed only briefly before being consumed by their own fears and weaknesses. The letter had shown her who David had been, but it couldn't tell her who he was now. And that, Alana realized with a mixture of sadness and relief, was no longer her responsibility to discover. She had Theodore, had a new baby growing inside her, had a life built on foundations that might be less passionate, but were infinitely more stable. The man who'd written that letter was part of her past, a ghost who deserved acknowledgement but not resurrection. Even if part of her heart would always wonder what might have happened if that David, the tender, hopeful one who'd planted roses and made promises in the darkness, had been strong enough to survive the harsh light of day. Chapter 6. The Storm and the Shelter. Some truths can only be spoken in darkness, when thunder drowns out the voice of reason and lightning illuminates hearts that have learned to hide in shadows. The storm rolled into Magnolia Springs like divine intervention, transforming a peaceful Thursday afternoon into something primordial and wild. Alana had been at the town library, researching wedding vendors with Ophelia Sterling, when the first crack of thunder shook the building's century-old bones and sent them both looking toward windows that had suddenly gone dark as evening. "Lord, have mercy," Ophelia murmured, her silver hair catching the strange green light that preceded the worst storms. "That's going to be a fierce one. You'd better stay put until it passes, dear." The library felt like a ship riding out a hurricane, its tall windows rattling with each gust of wind, while rain began to drum against the roof with increasing intensity. Alana had called Theodore but reached only crackling voicemail. She was settling in with a book of local history when the front door burst open, admitting a figure silhouetted against the storm's fury. David stepped inside, his hair plastered to his head and his shirt soaked through, looking like a man caught by nature's sudden violence. "David!" Ophelia called from behind the circulation desk. "Thank goodness you made it before the worst of it." He shook rain from his jacket, his movements careful and apologetic. "I was walking back from the hardware store when it hit. Augustus said these old buildings were the safest place to weather a storm." Alana watched from her reading nook, noting how different he looked from the polished businessman she'd once known. His clothes were simple working attire, his hands bore honest labor's calluses, and there was something in his posture that spoke of humility learned through loss rather than taught through privilege. "Well, you're both here now," Ophelia said with maternal authority that brooked no argument. "I'll put on some coffee and we'll wait this one out together." As if summoned by her words, the power flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging them into the green-tinged twilight of the storm. Emergency lighting kicked in briefly before failing as well, leaving them in near darkness punctuated only by wild flashes of lightning. "Candles in the supply closet," Ophelia announced, her voice unperturbed. "Been through this dance before. David, there's a flashlight in the front desk drawer." Within minutes they'd transformed the library into something magical. Candles flickering from every surface, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books that had survived decades of storms and human drama. The three of them gathered in the main reading area, where comfortable chairs formed an impromptu circle of warmth and light. "Nothing to do now but wait it out," Ophelia said, settling into her favorite chair with coffee that steamed in the candlelight. "These storms usually blow through in an hour or two." Alana found herself acutely aware of David's presence across the circle of light. The way flickering candles emphasized the changes in his face, lines that hadn't been there before, a gravity that spoke of hard-won wisdom. When lightning illuminated the room, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I should probably try Theodore again," she said, reaching for her phone only to find it completely dead. "Old-fashioned communication it is, then," Ophelia said with a chuckle. "Sometimes I think we were better off when storms forced us to simply be present with whoever we were with." The words hung in the candlelit air like a gentle challenge. Here they were, Alana, David, and the woman who'd watched over Magnolia Springs stories for 40 years, trapped together by forces beyond their control. "Mrs. Sterling," David said quietly, "how long have you known Alana?" "Oh, since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, coming in here with her grandmother every Saturday morning. Always had her nose in a book about true love and happy endings. Broke my heart when she left town so sudden-like." Alana felt heat rise in her cheeks, aware of David listening to stories from her childhood. "She used to write stories," Ophelia continued. "Beautiful, romantic things about knights and princesses and love that conquered every obstacle." "I remember," David said softly, and Alana's breath caught. "She used to tell me stories about the art we'd see at galleries, making up histories for people in portraits, giving them love stories that would make you believe in magic." The admission fell into the storm-muffled silence like a stone dropped in still water. Alana remembered those gallery visits, how David used to hang on every word of her improvised tales. "Art tells the truth about people," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Sometimes the truth they want to hide, sometimes the truth they don't even know about themselves." "And what truth do you think my portrait would tell?" David asked, the question carrying more weight than casual curiosity. Alana studied his face in the flickering candlelight, seeing not the successful businessman who'd betrayed her, but the man who'd written letters to their unborn child, who'd promised to choose love over ambition and then somehow lost his way. "I think it would show someone carrying a heavy burden," she said finally. "Someone who's learned that losing everything can sometimes be the only way to find out what actually matters." Thunder crashed overhead, so close it seemed to shake the building's foundations. In the brief silence that followed, David's voice was barely a whisper. "I brought something with me, something I should have given you 3 years ago." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a worn leather journal, its pages swollen with age and weather. "I wrote in this every day for 2 years after you left. Letters I never sent, thoughts I couldn't voice, apologies that were too little and too late." He held the journal out across the circle of candlelight, his hand trembling slightly. "You don't have to read it, but I needed you to know that not a day passed when I didn't think about what I'd destroyed." Alana stared at the journal, afraid to touch it. afraid of what truths it might contain. "David, I can't." "You don't have to," he said quickly. "But there's something in there you need to know, about Serafina, about what really happened, about why I was too ashamed to fight for our marriage even after I realized what I'd lost." "Tell me," she whispered. "Serafina was never interested in me," David said, his voice raw with shame. "She was hired by Richardson and Associates, my biggest competitors. They wanted inside information about our client base, our strategies. She played me like a violin, made me feel like I deserved someone who understood power and ambition." The words fell like hammer blows in the candlelit silence. "The affair lasted 6 weeks. By the time I realized she was using me, she'd already gotten what she came for, but I was too proud to admit I'd been played, too ashamed to confess that I'd destroyed our marriage for someone who'd never felt anything for me at all." Alana felt something crack open in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The man she'd married had been seduced not just by another woman, but by a version of himself that had never really existed. "So you let me believe it was about love," she said quietly. "Because the truth was worse, that I'd thrown away everything real for something completely fabricated. That I'd been so desperate to become someone important that I'd become someone unrecognizable instead." The storm was beginning to move on, the thunder growing more distant, but the three of them remained in their circle of candlelight, bound together by truths that had taken a blackout to illuminate. What happened to her? "She took everything, the business, most of my money, the reputation I'd thought was so important. Then she moved on to her next target." Ophelia, who'd been listening with patient attention, finally spoke. "Storms like this one strip away everything that isn't firmly rooted. They show us what's really strong and what's just been pretending to be." Her words carried the weight of prophecy, and Alana found herself looking at David, really looking at him, for the first time since he'd returned to Magnolia Springs. The man sitting across from her wasn't the successful businessman who'd betrayed her, or the broken figure who'd lost everything to schemes, but someone else entirely, someone who'd been carved by loss and shaped by regret into something more honest than either version that had come before. "I should get home," she said, as the rain began to soften. "Theodore will be worried." But she didn't move, and neither did David, and the candles continued to burn while outside, the storm spent its fury and moved on, leaving behind the strange peace that comes after nature reminds human beings how small they really are. In that peace, surrounded by books that had survived their own storms, Alana faced the most dangerous truth of all, that understanding David's betrayal hadn't made it hurt less, but it had made the hurt feel different, less like personal rejection and more like shared tragedy. And that difference, she realized with growing alarm, might be the first crack in the careful walls she'd built around her heart. Chapter 7. The Unveiling of Hearts. Sometimes we discover who we truly are, not in moments of joy, but in the spaces between what we expected and what we actually need, when the masks we wear become too heavy to carry and truth becomes the only thing light enough to breathe. The Magnolia Springs Harvest Festival bloomed across the town square like a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. All amber sunlight and the sweet scent of caramel apples carried on autumn breezes. Alana walked through the festivities arm in arm with Theodore, who'd arrived that morning from Charleston with careful punctuality that marked all his approaches to her life. She should have been happy. The festival was everything she loved about small-town life as a child. Local musicians playing bluegrass on a makeshift stage, children running between booths with painted faces, elderly couples sharing funnel cake on wooden benches worn smooth by decades of community gatherings. But Theodore's presence seemed to create an invisible barrier between her and the easy warmth of the celebration. He observed rather than participated, commented rather than experienced, treating the festival like an anthropological study rather than a joyful immersion in community spirit. Charming, in a provincial sort of way, he murmured as they passed a booth where Magnolia Sinclair was selling hand-knitted scarves with infectious enthusiasm. Very authentic. The word stung more than it should have. Authentic, as if her hometown were a quaint tourist attraction rather than a place where real people lived real lives with genuine connections. "These people raised me," Alana said quietly. "They're not performing authenticity, Theodore. They're just being themselves." "Of course, darling. I didn't mean anything disparaging. It's just different from what we're used to in Charleston, more rustic." Before Alana could respond, Guinevere Ashford appeared beside them like a whirlwind in purple silk, her silver hair adorned with autumn leaves, and her eyes bright with the sort of mischief that came from 87 years of speaking her mind without apology. "Alana, sweetheart, and you must be the famous fiancé we've all heard so much about." Guinevere extended a ringed hand to Theodore with regal grace. "I'm Guinevere Ashford. I knew your grandmother back when we were both young and foolish enough to believe the world owed us something." Theodore accepted her handshake with polite wariness, clearly uncertain how to categorize this elegant woman who looked like she belonged in a Parisian salon but spoke with warm, small-town directness. "Mrs. Ashford, what a pleasure. Alana's told me so much about the wonderful people here." "I'm sure she has, though I doubt she's told you the half of it. We're a complicated bunch, we Magnolia Springs folk. Seems simple on the surface, but most of us have depths that would surprise you." Guinevere's eyes found Alana's, carrying a message that felt both warning and invitation. "Speaking of depths, I saw young David at the garden earlier. Amazing what a man can accomplish when he's working to save something instead of trying to own it." Theodore's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on Alana's arm. "David?" "David Kane," Guinevere said with casual directness that could shatter careful pretenses. "Alana's former husband. He's been volunteering at the community garden, bringing Marianne Ashford's roses back to life. Quite beautifully, actually. There's something to be said for a man who understands that some things can't be rushed, only tended." The words hung in the autumn air like a challenge. Neither Theodore nor Alana quite knew how to meet. Alana felt Theodore's posture shift, becoming more protective, more possessive. "How nice," Theodore said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "I'm sure Alana appreciates knowing her former husband is keeping busy." "Oh, it's more than keeping busy, young man. It's about redemption, about learning that love isn't something you take, but something you give. About understanding that the most beautiful things grow from the ugliest soil if you're patient enough to tend them properly." Guinevere's words carried the weight of someone who'd witnessed enough love stories to know the difference between those built on solid ground and those constructed on shifting sand. "Mrs. Ashford," Alana interrupted, desperate to redirect the conversation, "are you entering anything in the baking competition this year?" "My famous apple tart, same as every year for the past 23 years. As they talked, Alana became aware of a familiar presence at the edge of her vision. David stood near the bandstand, not participating in the festivities, but simply observing with careful attention of someone who'd learned to appreciate beauty without feeling entitled to possess it. He wore simple jeans and a white button-down shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms bronzed by weeks of garden work. There was something different about the way he held himself, less of the restless energy she remembered from their marriage, more of the quiet stillness that came from someone who'd learned to be content with small moments and simple pleasures. "Would you like to dance, darling?" Theodore's voice pulled her attention back to the man beside her. "The music is lovely, but perhaps we should find somewhere to sit. You've been on your feet quite a bit today, and we must think of the baby." The gentle refusal, wrapped in concern for her pregnancy, felt like silk scarves binding her wrists. Theodore's love came with so many protective limitations, so many careful boundaries designed to keep her safe from anything that might cause discomfort or challenge. "I'd actually love to dance," she said, surprised by her own words. "The baby and I are both perfectly capable of swaying to music." "Darling, I don't think that's wise. The crowd, the uneven ground, the risk of someone bumping into you. Why don't we find a quiet cafe instead, somewhere more suitable for meaningful conversation?" Each protective objection felt like another layer of cotton wool being wrapped around her spirit. Theodore meant well. She knew that with absolute certainty. But his version of love felt increasingly like a beautiful cage, designed to keep her safe at the cost of keeping her truly alive. "Actually, I think I'd like some fresh air," she said, gently extracting her arm from his grip. "Maybe a walk around the perimeter of the festival." "I'll come with you, of course." "Actually, Theodore, would you mind getting us some of that apple cider? I've been craving it all week." It was a polite dismissal, and they both knew it. Theodore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his cultured upbringing wouldn't allow him to make a scene in public. "Of course, darling. I'll be right back." As soon as Theodore disappeared into the crowd, Guinevere stepped closer to Alana with conspiratorial air that suggested this moment had been orchestrated rather than accidental. "Walk with me, child. These old bones need exercise, and these old eyes need to show you something." They strolled toward the edge of the festival, where the organized chaos of the celebration gave way to quieter beauty of the town's residential streets. Guinevere walked with measured pace of someone who'd learned that important conversations couldn't be rushed. "You know, I've been watching love stories unfold in this town for 8 decades. I've seen every variation: young love and mature love, passionate love and comfortable love, love that burns bright and fast, and love that grows slowly like good wine." "Mrs. Ashford, let me finish, dear one. I've also learned to recognize the difference between love that makes you more yourself and love that asks you to become less yourself. Between love that sees you as you are and love that wants to reshape you into something more manageable." They paused beside a wooden bench beneath an ancient oak tree, its leaves turning gold and crimson in the late afternoon light. From this vantage point, they could see the entire festival spread out below them like a living tapestry. "Your Theodore is a good man," Guinevere continued. "Kind, successful, devoted to your happiness. But sometimes I watch the way he hovers over you, the way he makes decisions about what's best for you without asking what you actually want. And I wonder if he's in love with you or with the idea of protecting something precious." The words hit closer to home than Alana was comfortable acknowledging. "He cares about me, about the baby. He wants us to be safe." "Safety is important, child, but so is growth, so is challenge. So is the messy, complicated, sometimes painful business of being fully human." Guinevere's eyes found Alana's with gentle intensity. "And sometimes the safest love isn't the truest love." Before Alana could respond, Guinevere nodded toward the festival below. "Look there, by the craft booths. Do you see him?" David was helping Imogen Sterling navigate between tables with packages of handmade quilts, his attention completely focused on ensuring the elderly woman didn't stumble on the uneven ground. There was something infinitely gentle about the way he matched his pace to hers, the way he listened to her directions with patient respect. 3 years ago, that man was so consumed with his own importance that he couldn't see past his ambitions to the love that was right in front of him, Guinevere observed. Now look at him, putting someone else's needs before his own without expectation of reward or recognition. That's what real change looks like, dear one. Alana watched David help Imogen settle her purchases, then stay to chat, despite the fact that the festival held dozens of more exciting distractions. The man she'd married would have made polite conversation for precisely the right amount of time before moving on to more important people. "People don't really change," she said, echoing Theodore's words. "They just reveal who they always were underneath." "Sometimes that's true," Guinevere agreed, "but sometimes people get broken so completely that they have no choice but to rebuild themselves from scratch. And sometimes, if they're very lucky and very determined, they rebuild something better than what was broken." "Mrs. Ashford, what are you really trying to tell me?" The elderly woman smiled, her face creasing into lines carved by decades of laughter and wisdom and gentle acceptance of life's beautiful complexities. "I'm trying to tell you that your heart knows things your mind hasn't figured out yet, and that sometimes the greatest risk isn't in loving someone who might hurt you, but in choosing safety over truth, comfort over growth, the predictable over the transformative." She stood, brushing autumn leaves from her purple dress with elegant efficiency. "But mostly, I'm trying to tell you that whatever you choose, it should be your choice. Not Theodore's, not David's, not even this old woman's, yours. Based on what your soul needs to flourish, not just what your mind thinks will keep you protected." As Guinevere walked back toward the festival, leaving Alana alone with her thoughts and the view of two very different men who'd both claimed to love her, the truth settled over her like twilight, gentle but inescapable. She was standing at a crossroads that would define not just her future, but the woman she would become. The safe path led toward Theodore and a life of careful protection and predictable happiness. The other path led toward uncertainty, toward the possibility of a love that had been broken and rebuilt, toward a man who'd learned too late what she was worth, but might finally be worthy of what she had to give. Both men were waiting for her in the golden light of the festival below, and for the first time since David's return, Alana allowed herself to consider the terrifying possibility that the choice between them wasn't as clear as she'd tried to make it seem. Chapter 8. The Confession of Souls. The heart recognizes truth long before the mind accepts it, and sometimes the most dangerous revelations come not from what we discover about others, but from what we finally admit about ourselves. Alana found Theodore in her grandmother's kitchen the next morning, sitting at the weathered oak table with her personal journal open before him, like evidence in a trial she hadn't known she was facing. The sight stopped her cold, coffee mug freezing halfway to her lips. "Theodore?" Her voice carried the particular hurt that comes from having sacred boundaries crossed by someone who was supposed to protect them. He looked up without apparent shame, his expression carrying patient concern she'd once found comforting, but now recognized as something more troubling, the look of someone who believed he knew what was best for her better than she did. "Good morning, darling. I was looking for your address book to confirm wedding RSVPs, and I found this lying open on your bedside table." He gestured to the journal as if its violation were incidental. "Some of these entries are quite concerning." Alana set down her coffee with trembling hands, her mind racing through what intimate thoughts he might have consumed without permission. The journal contained everything: her fears about their relationship, her confusion about David's return, her growing uncertainty about the life they were planning together. "That's my private journal, Theodore. You had no right—" "Darling, we're getting married in 3 weeks. Surely we're past keeping secrets from each other." His tone carried gentle reproach of someone correcting a child's misunderstanding. "Besides, I'm glad I read it. You've been struggling with troubling thoughts, and it's time we addressed them directly." He turned to a marked page, clearing his throat with legal authority. "I keep thinking about the man David used to be before success changed him. Sometimes I wonder if that man still exists, somewhere beneath all the mistakes and regrets." Heat flooded Alana's cheeks as her own words were used against her, thoughts meant for her eyes alone, twisted into evidence of betrayal. "Theodore, those are just processing thoughts. Working through complicated feelings doesn't mean—" There's more. He flipped to another marked page. Theodore loves me completely, but sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing inside his care, like he's protecting me from anything that might cause pain and anything that might cause growth. The accuracy of her own observations, spoken back in Theodore's controlled voice, made her feel exposed and ashamed for having feelings that didn't fit neatly into the life he'd planned. I'm trying to understand what's happening here. When you accepted my proposal, I thought we were committed to building a stable future together. But these entries suggest serious doubts about our relationship and, frankly, inappropriate thoughts about your former husband. Alana sank into the chair across from him, feeling like a woman whose autonomy was being systematically dismantled by someone who claimed to love her. Theodore, everyone has complicated thoughts. Having feelings doesn't mean I'm going to act on them. It just means I'm human. But that's exactly my point, sweetheart. You shouldn't have to work through anything. We have a good life planned, stable, secure, built on mutual respect. If you're satisfied with what we have, why are you entertaining fantasies about a man who hurt you so badly you lost your first baby? The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated to remind her of David's capacity for destruction while positioning Theodore as her salvation. I'm not entertaining fantasies. I'm trying to understand the past so I can move forward with clarity instead of just reaction. But don't you see how dangerous that is? This man destroyed your life once, Alana. The fact that he's temporarily reformed doesn't change his fundamental character. Theodore reached across to take her hands, his touch gentle but constraining. I've been patient with this situation. I've watched you struggle with his presence, seen how unsettled you've become, but it's time to face reality. As long as David Kane is in Magnolia Springs, you'll never fully commit to our future. What are you saying? I'm saying it's time to choose, him or me, the past or the future, the chaos of whatever broken thing you think you can rebuild, or the security I'm offering you. His ultimatum settled over the kitchen like morning frost, beautiful in its clarity but deadly to anything fragile, trying to grow beneath its weight. If you choose me, truly choose me, we'll leave for Charleston today, plan the wedding from there, start fresh, away from the ghosts keeping you from moving forward. And if I don't, then I'll know what I thought was love was actually just your fear of being alone, and I'll step aside so you can make whatever mistakes you need to make. The ultimatum was delivered with such gentle reasonableness that it took Alana a moment to recognize it for what it was. Emotional manipulation, wrapped in the language of love and protection. Theodore, relationships don't work that way. You can't demand someone erase their entire history to prove commitment. I'm not asking you to erase your history. I'm asking you to stop living in it. He stood, straightening his clothes with precise movements, suggesting controlled frustration. I'll be at the bed and breakfast until noon, but Alana, I won't compete with a ghost, and I won't build a marriage on unresolved feelings for another man. After he left, Alana sat alone in the kitchen that had witnessed generations of women facing impossible choices, her journal still open to pages that felt like violations. Her phone rang, Ophelia Sterling's name appearing like a lifeline. Good morning, dear. Someone left a letter for you at the library this morning. Slipped it under the door during the night with your name in very careful handwriting. A letter. Beautiful stationery. The expensive kind that suggests whatever's inside is important. Would you like me to bring it by or collect it yourself? Alana's heart raced with intuitive knowledge that the letter was from David, that whatever he'd written would make her choices more complicated rather than clearer. I'll come get it. Give me 20 minutes. The walk took her past the community garden, where David's figure bent over Marianne's rose bed, his movements careful and reverent as he tended plants showing signs of new growth. The sight of him working in morning light, absorbed in nurturing something beautiful, made her chest tighten with unnamed emotions. The letter Ophelia handed her was indeed beautiful. cream-colored paper with her name in David's careful script. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing pages that seemed to carry 3 years' worth of unspoken truths. My dearest Alana, I'm writing this at dawn, watching the sunrise from the cottage porch and thinking about all the sunrises we missed during our marriage because I was too busy chasing things that didn't matter to notice the beauty that was right beside me every morning. By the time you read this, I'll be gone from Magnolia Springs. Not because anyone asked me to leave, but because I finally understand what love actually means, and it means wanting someone's happiness more than your own presence in their life. I've watched you these past weeks, seen the way you light up when you talk to neighbors who've known you since childhood, witnessed the peace settles over you when you're working in your grandmother's garden. You belong here, Alana. You've found your place in the world, surrounded by people who love you for exactly who you are. I've also watched Theodore with you, seen the way he cares for you, protects you, wants to build a life that will keep you safe from all the chaos and heartbreak I brought into your world 3 years ago. He can give you everything I took away: security, stability, the promise that he'll never be reckless with your heart the way I was. I know you're confused about my presence here, about whether the man who wrote those letters to our unborn baby still exists somewhere inside the one who betrayed everything we built together. The truth is, I don't know either. I only know that losing you taught me what love actually looks like, and it looks like this, like walking away when staying would only complicate the peace you've fought so hard to find. You deserve a love that doesn't ask you to risk everything you've rebuilt. You deserve a man who sees your strength without testing it, who appreciates your capacity for forgiveness without abusing it, who understands that trust, once broken, becomes a precious and fragile thing that must be earned back through actions, not words. I'm not that man, Alana. I might have been once, might be again someday if I continue doing the work of becoming someone worthy of the love you're capable of giving. But I'm not that man today, and you shouldn't have to wait for me to become him. Theodore loves you in ways I never learned how to love you when I had the chance. Choose him, my darling. Choose the life he's offering, the security he represents, the future he's planned with such careful attention to your happiness. I will love you in silence for the rest of my days, carrying the memory of what we almost were, and the knowledge that letting you go is the most loving thing I've ever done. I realize now what I told Serafina in my final moment of clarity when she was walking away with everything I thought mattered. I lost a queen for a woman who was never even real. You were my queen, Alana, and I was too blind to see your crown until it was too late. All my love, always, David. The roses in Marianne's garden are blooming now, small blossoms, but perfect in their simplicity. I like to think she would have been pleased to know they survived the winter and found their way back to beauty. Some things, it turns out, are more resilient than they appear. The letter slipped from Alana's hands as tears she hadn't expected blurred her vision. Outside the library windows, Magnolia Springs continued its gentle daily rhythm, unaware that the words on cream-colored stationery had just rewritten everything she thought she understood about love, sacrifice, and the difference between holding on and letting go. Chapter 9. The Choice Between Safe and Soul. In the end, the most important choice isn't between two people who love you, but between two versions of yourself, the one who chooses safety and the one who chooses truth, even when truth promises no guarantees except the terrifying freedom to become who you're meant to be. Alana sat in her grandmother's rose garden with David's letter pressed against her chest, feeling as if the ground beneath her had shifted to reveal foundations she'd never known existed. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and possibility, but inside her heart, a storm was building that threatened to uproot every careful plan she'd made for her future. Theodore's ultimatum echoed in her mind like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Choose him or me, the past or the future. But David's letter had reframed the choice entirely, revealing it not as a competition between two men, but as a decision about what kind of woman she wanted to become. The roses her grandmother had planted decades ago bloomed around her in wild profusion, not the carefully pruned specimens Theodore would have preferred, but something untamed and magnificent, beauty that came from growing according to its own nature rather than someone else's design. "Child, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world." Alana looked up to find Cordelia Whitmore standing at the garden gate, her silver hair catching morning light like a halo around a face that had witnessed 83 years of human joys and sorrows. "Miss Cordelia, I was just thinking about that letter you're clutching like a life preserver, I'd imagine." The elderly woman's eyes held gentle perception that came from decades of watching people struggle with life-defining choices. "Mind if an old woman sits with you? These bones don't like to stand as long as they used to." Alana gestured to the wooden bench her grandmother had placed among the roses, and Cordelia settled beside her with careful grace. "I saw David loading his truck this morning. Looked like a man who'd made a hard decision and was determined to see it through, regardless of cost. He's leaving town. Says it's better for everyone if he goes." "And what do you say?" The question hung in the morning air like incense, demanding honesty that Alana wasn't sure she was ready to give. What did she say? That part of her was relieved he was removing himself from an impossible situation. That another part felt like something essential was being torn away just when she'd begun to understand its value. "I don't know what I say. I don't even know what I feel anymore." Cordelia nodded with understanding of someone who'd faced her own impossible choices. "Tell me about Theodore's visit this morning. The whole town heard him leave, and that car doesn't exactly whisper when it's angry." Despite everything, Alana found herself almost smiling. In Magnolia Springs, even private drama became community concern, not from nosiness, but from genuine care. "He read my journal, without permission, then gave me an ultimatum: choose him and leave town today, or lose him forever." Ah, Cordelia's single syllable carried volumes of judgment and understanding. And what did that feel like, having your private thoughts used as evidence against you? Like being on trial for having feelings. Like being told that emotional complexity was somehow a betrayal of love instead of just being human. That's because it was, child. What Theodore did wasn't love. It was control dressed up in pretty words and justified by concern. Real love doesn't punish you for having a complicated heart. Alana thought about Theodore's reaction to her journal entries, the way he'd used her own words to prove she was somehow failing as a partner. But he's right about some things. David did hurt me terribly. And Theodore does offer security, stability, everything I thought I wanted after my world fell apart. Security is important, but so is growth. So is the freedom to become who you're meant to be, even if that person is more complicated than someone else wants you to be. She plucked a rose from the nearest bush, a deep red bloom that had opened fully, revealing layers of petals that grew more complex the deeper you looked. "Your grandmother and I used to talk about love, back when we were young women trying to figure out the mysteries of the heart. She used to say there were two kinds of love in this world: love that tries to keep you safe by making you smaller, and love that helps you grow by seeing who you really are and celebrating that person, even when it's inconvenient." Which kind did she have with my grandfather? The growing kind. Lord knows they had their struggles. Two strong-willed people don't always make for easy partnership, but they brought out the best in each other, challenged each other to become more than they would have been alone. Cordelia's weathered hands turned the rose stem gently, examining its thorns with acceptance of someone who understood that beauty and pain often grew from the same source. "Theodore loves you, child, I can see that. But his love asks you to become smaller, safer, more manageable. It's love, but it's also fear. Fear that if you're fully yourself, you might choose something that scares him. And David? David's learning what your grandmother's kind of love looks like. Love that sees your strength without fearing it, that appreciates your complexity without trying to simplify it, that understands real partnership means growing together instead of one person protecting the other from growing at all. Alana thought about the differences between the two men. Theodore's careful arrangements and protective restrictions, David's silent support in the garden, and his willingness to walk away rather than complicate her peace. But what if I choose David and he hurts me again? What if this change isn't real? What if I'm just being foolish, risking everything secure for something that might not last? What if you choose Theodore and spend the rest of your life wondering who you might have become if you'd been brave enough to risk growing instead of safe enough to stop? The counter-question hit like revelation, showing Alana the real choice she was facing. Not between two men, but between two versions of her future self. One who chose security over authenticity, and one who chose the terrifying beauty of becoming fully human, even if it meant risking everything she'd built from heartbreak's ashes. How do I know which choice is right? You listen to the voice that gets quieter when other people talk, but stronger when you're alone with truth. The voice that knows things your mind hasn't figured out yet. Cordelia stood, brushing rose petals from her dress with movements that spoke of decades of tending beautiful, complicated things. Your grandmother left you this house for a reason, child. She knew you'd need a place to remember who you were before the world tried to convince you to be someone else. Sit here among her roses for a while. Let them remind you that the most beautiful things grow wild, according to their own nature, not according to someone else's plan for their safety. After Cordelia left, Alana remained in the garden as morning stretched toward afternoon, holding David's letter and feeling the weight of choice settle over her like gravity, inescapable, fundamental, life-defining. Theodore would be waiting at the bed and breakfast until noon, his ultimatum ticking like a countdown to the moment when her indecision would become decision by default. David would be gone by evening, removing himself from her life with the same devastating thoroughness with which he'd once destroyed it. She thought about the woman she'd been when she'd first fallen in love with David. Passionate, creative, unafraid of emotional complexity or the beautiful messiness of deep connection. Then she thought about the woman she'd become in response to Theodore's love, careful, protected, increasingly smaller in her dreams and desires. Which woman was she really? Which woman did she want to become? The roses bloomed around her in answer, wild, uncontrolled, magnificent in their refusal to be anything other than what they were meant to be. They'd survived winters and storms and neglect, but they'd never survived by becoming less than their essential nature. As the sun reached its zenith, casting short shadows that offered no place to hide from truth, Alana finally understood what her heart had been trying to tell her. The choice wasn't between David and Theodore. The choice was between fear and love, between safety and authenticity, between the woman who'd learned to make herself smaller to fit inside someone else's protection and the woman who'd learned to trust her own strength, even when it led into uncertain territory. She stood, brushing soil from her grandmother's garden from her clothes, and walked toward the house to make the phone call that would determine not just her future, but her fundamental relationship with her own soul. Behind her, the roses continued their ancient dance with sunlight and breeze, growing wild and beautiful and completely, unapologetically themselves. Chapter 10. When Love Returns Home. True love doesn't arrive with fanfare or certainty. It comes like dawn after the longest night, quiet and inevitable, transforming everything it touches, not through force, but through the simple miracle of finally seeing clearly. The train station in Magnolia Springs was little more than a wooden platform beside railroad tracks that had carried dreams and departures for over a century. David stood with his single duffel bag, watching afternoon light slant through ancient oak trees while waiting for the 3:47 to Atlanta, the first step in a journey that would take him far from the woman he'd learned to love by learning to let her go. He'd said his goodbyes that morning, Augustus at the garden, pressing a small envelope into his hands with gruff instruction to plant these somewhere that needs beauty. Evangeline at the cottage, refusing to take back his unused deposit. Ophelia at the library, thanking him for helping repair storm-damaged shelves. Each farewell had felt like shedding another layer of the man who'd come to Magnolia Springs seeking redemption and found something infinitely more valuable. Understanding that love wasn't about getting what you wanted, but about wanting what was best for the person you loved, even when that meant disappearing from their story entirely. The train's whistle echoed across the fields like a mournful song, and David picked up his bag, preparing to board a vehicle that would carry him toward whatever life awaited a man who'd learned too late how to love properly. That's when he heard her voice. "David, wait!" He turned, certain his imagination was playing the cruelest possible trick, and saw Alana running across the platform with her grandmother's wedding dress, bundled in her arms like captured sunlight. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, her face flushed with exertion and something that looked remarkably like joy. "Alana, what are you? The train is here. You shouldn't. I know it's here. I know I shouldn't be. I know this is crazy and impulsive, and everything Theodore would say is exactly wrong." She stopped in front of him, breathing hard, her eyes bright with tears that somehow looked like celebration. "But I also know that I can't let you leave without telling you that you were wrong." "Wrong about what?" "About not being the man I need, about me deserving someone who doesn't challenge me to grow, about walking away being the most loving thing you could do." She shifted the wedding dress to one arm, freeing her hand to reach toward his face with trembling courage. "The most loving thing you could do is stay, if you want to, if you think we could." David's bag dropped to the platform as her words reorganized his entire understanding of the world. "Alana, are you saying—" "I'm saying that Theodore was right about one thing. I had to choose. But he was wrong about what the choice actually was." Her voice carried the clarity of someone who'd finally stopped fighting their own heart. "It wasn't between you and him. It was between the woman who's learned to make herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of safety, and the woman who's brave enough to choose growth over comfort, love that challenges me to become who I'm meant to be." The train conductor called all aboard, but neither moved, existing in a bubble of possibility that made the rest of the world seem distant and unimportant. "What about Theodore?" "Theodore loves the version of me that needs his protection, but you love the version of me that doesn't need protection at all, that needs partnership, challenge, someone who sees my strength and wants to grow alongside it." She laughed, a sound like water over stones. "I broke our engagement this morning. Told him I couldn't marry someone who thought having complicated feelings was a betrayal of love. He left for Charleston convinced I'm making the biggest mistake of my life." "And are you?" "Maybe, probably, but if I am, it'll be my mistake to make, and I'd rather make it as the woman I actually am than succeed as someone I've pretended to be." David stared at this magnificent creature who'd learned to choose courage over safety, truth over comfort, the terrifying beauty of authentic love over the predictable peace of managed affection. "Alana, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same man who wrote you love letters and planted roses on our balcony, but I'm also not the same man who betrayed everything we built together. I'm someone else entirely, someone who's been broken down to essential parts and rebuilt with better understanding of what matters. I know. I've been watching you these past weeks, seeing the way you tend Marianne's roses like prayers, the way you helped people without expecting gratitude, the way you were willing to walk away from everything you wanted because you thought it was better for me." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her grandmother's perfume in her hair. "That's not the behavior of someone who hasn't changed. That's the behavior of someone who's learned what love actually looks like." The train whistle blew again, more insistent, but David found he couldn't make his feet move toward it. Not when Alana was looking at him like he was something precious instead of something dangerous. "What about the baby?" "Theodore's baby." Alana's hand moved to her stomach, protective and possessive. This baby was conceived in love, even if it wasn't the right love. "If you're asking whether I can love this child, knowing it connects me to someone else, the answer is yes, completely. If you're asking whether you could love a child that isn't biologically yours, then you don't know me as well as you think you do." David's voice was rough with emotion as he reached toward her face, fingertips tracing her cheek like a man touching something holy. "I lost one baby because I was too selfish to protect what we'd created together. If you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life making sure this baby knows what it means to be loved unconditionally by a father who understands that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, commitment, showing up every day to tend something beautiful." The train doors closed with mechanical finality, and the conductor leaned out to shout a final warning. But David and Alana remained on the platform, wrapped in each other's arms, as steel wheels began to turn and carry away the future David had thought was his only option. "Are you sure?" he whispered against her hair. "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Because if we do this, if we try again, I need to know you're choosing me not because I'm familiar or convenient, but because you believe we can build something better than what we destroyed. I'm choosing you because you're the only person who's ever made me feel like being completely myself was not just acceptable, but magical." She pulled back to look into his eyes, her own shining with tears that looked like starlight. "I'm choosing you because when I imagine growing old, I see myself growing wild instead of growing careful, growing deeper instead of growing smaller." "And I'm choosing you," David said, his voice carrying the weight of vows made not in churches, but in train stations. Not with rings, but with whole hearts finally brave enough to trust again. "Because you taught me that love isn't about possession or protection, but about witnessing someone's full humanity and calling it beautiful, even when it's complicated, even when it refuses to fit into easy categories." They married 3 weeks later under the oak tree, where Marianne's roses bloomed in wild profusion, surrounded by the entire town of Magnolia Springs and officiated by the Methodist minister who'd baptized half the people in attendance. Alana wore her grandmother's dress, altered to accommodate the growing child she carried like a promise of futures yet to be written. When David slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, not the elaborate ring Theodore had chosen, but something clean and honest that spoke of commitment rather than possession, he whispered words only she could hear. "I promise to love you not carefully, but completely. Not safely, but truly. Not by trying to protect you from growing, but by growing alongside you for all the seasons we're given." And when Alana spoke her own vows, her voice carried the strength of someone who'd learned the difference between settling and choosing. "I promise to love you not because it's easy, but because it's real. Not because you're perfect, but because you're perfect for the woman I'm becoming. Not in spite of our complicated history, but because of it, because it taught us both what love looks like when it's tested and chooses to emerge stronger." 6 months later, when their daughter was born with Theodore's delicate features and Alana's stubborn chin, when she wrapped her tiny fingers around the finger of the man who'd chosen to be her father not through biology, but through love, the circle that had been broken years before finally became whole again. not the same circle, that had been lost to mistakes and time and the necessary growing that comes from being shattered and reassembled, but something new, something stronger, something that could hold the weight of two people who'd learned that the most beautiful love stories aren't about people who never hurt each other, but about people who hurt each other and choose to heal together, to grow together, to become together something neither could have been alone. In the garden where roses bloomed wild and magnificent, where broken things learned to grow again, where love returned home not as it had been, but as it was always meant to be.